Hello everybody and welcome to the movies I watched this month. We've officially entered 2024 and have a whole other 12 months of new movies to check out, but for now, here's what I've been up to. There will be no major spoilers in this video, so it is safe to watch if you want to check any of these films out, and without any further ado, here's what I watched in January 2024. To wrap up the Christmas season, I saw Elf, and I just don't get the love for this thing. I find Will Ferrell annoying at the best of times, but him acting like a complete man-child for 97 minutes is enough to drive me mentally insane. I'm sorry, but I just don't think him screaming at the top of his lungs and acting bizarrely in public is all that funny. It just makes me uncomfortable. To be fair, the beginning of the film is actually fine. I don't mind the North Pole as a location, and I find the set designs to be somewhat charming, especially with the stop-motion characters like Leon and Mr. Narwhal, but once he sets off for New York, things begin to fall apart for me. The whole plot relies on overused Christmas movie cliches like the father who focuses too much on work, the day being saved by Christmas spirit and believing in Santa, plus a forced romance subplot that doesn't really serve any purpose to the story or the characters' motivations or development. I'm not a huge fan of Christmas films in general. I find that their insistence on making you feel cheerful ends up being quite tiring, but I can stomach through them for the sake of making my partner happy. Elf, however, is the one film that starts to give me a migraine just thinking about it, and I'm sorry, but no amount of Peter Dinklage hamming it up can make up for that. Adaptation is a film about Charlie Kaufman, the person who wrote Being John Malkovich, struggling to adapt a novel into a new screenplay, going off the rails and becoming self-indulgent enough to write himself into the story, which ends up being the film that you're watching. No one else is making movies like this, because the script is so smart and personal to Kaufman that it would literally be impossible to replicate. As dull as it may sound on the surface, it's a story about a struggling artist. Charlie suffers from writer's block and spends over an hour of the film trying to spur on a satisfying breakthrough, which is something that anyone who tries to be creative will be able to relate to. Sometimes it feels pointless, like a waste of time, but when you finally hit on something, the joy comes sparking back, which makes it all the more engaging to watch this character find his motivation. The last act of the movie does feel a little weaker and more unfocused than the first two, but the genius moment is when it inevitably clicks that it was done with intention. Charlie tells his brother Donald that he doesn't want to go the Hollywood route with his script, and force sex, guns and car chases into the story. Yet, lo and behold, that's exactly what ends up happening. He even goes against McKee's advice by making use of a Deus Ex Machina and voiceover in the climax. God knows how one can make something so original, particularly when it's supposed to be an adaptation of someone else's work, yet he always does, making him one of my favourite writers working in the industry today. I'm not really sure why they changed the title in English to The Boy and the Heron, when the original Japanese title, How Do You Live, seems far more thematically relevant. See, I come out of a new highly anticipated feature film from one of the industry's most respected animation studios, and that's the kind of thing I think about. It's hardly surprising really that these movies never really seem to click for me in the way they do for everyone else. That's not to say I didn't enjoy my time with it, because I certainly did, and I'd much rather watch more stuff like this than another Elemental or Wish. The animation here is gorgeous, God knows why we moved away from hand-drawn, particularly during Mahito's dream sequences. The music is also great, with not just a fantastical aesthetic to it, but also a hauntingly ethereal vibe as well. But most of all, I found that The Boy and the Heron is a film that left me with a feeling more than any real insightful or coherent thoughts. As much as that can be interpreted in a positive light, I also think it demonstrates the movie's biggest flaw in my eyes. It's a little hard to follow. Sure, the emotional beats were nailed down, but the sporadic narrative and awkward pacing made it more difficult to connect to the story, which could end up outweighing the pros for a lot of people. The movie takes a long time to get going and seems to wrap up out of nowhere, making the thing feel far more backloaded than it really should have. I really have tried to get into Studio Ghibli, and as much as I can appreciate their films for what they are and enjoy the actual animation, Their stories often feel relegated to the background in favour of the awe-inspiring visuals and weird set pieces that make them memorable. I can't exactly say that The Boy and the Heron is any different, but for what could be Hayao Miyazaki's final film, I don't know how they could create anything more fitting from a thematic standpoint. This movie was crazy. Titane was just a super uncomfortable watch for so many reasons, from the disgustingly visceral body horror to the delicate balancing act of keeping up a lie to someone that you've come to care about. The first 30 minutes of this thing verge on exploitation cinema, an incredibly transgressive experience that throws sex and violence at the wall in a way that sets it up as an erotic thriller. But the nudity here is never sexy. It's not done to be erotic, but to make you feel more vulnerable. Strangely though, the movie then shifts into a more or less straight-up drama, following the relationship of Alexia and Vincent. After the loss of his son, he needs someone to love and to share that intimacy with. Conversely, Alexia has become coldly detached from humanity, probably due to the strained relationship with her parents, so Vincent finally fills the role of someone to truly and unconditionally care for her. I suppose you could say that Alexia's affinity for cars and metal, combined with the titanium plate in her skull, are a reflection of how cold she's become. She's become distant to those around her, but it's Vincent's contrasting kindness that saves her. He loves her better than her father ever did, even when he suspects that she may not be who she seems. Titanium as a metal is very heat resistant and unlikely to be affected by most interactions, so leave it to a firefighter to bring enough warmth into her life to actually make an impact. Titane is ultimately a story about love, and our desire to be accepted. You can take it on the surface as someone who feels like an outcast for various reasons, but you can also look at it as a commentary on gender identity or body dysmorphia. It's actually kind of positive in its outlook on life, but do not get that confused with thinking it's an easy watch. It's challenging, for sure, but all the more rewarding for it. Well, this was nowhere near as bad as I remember it being. I had this thing in my head telling me that The Incredible Hulk was awful, and revisiting it now in 2024, it's not that bad. Sure, it's not great, but I think it was an essential stepping stone in Marvel deciding what tone they wanted for their cinematic universe. I appreciate that we didn't get an origin story here. He was affected by some radiation, and he changes when his heart rate gets too high. That's all we need to know, and the movie does benefit by letting us jump straight into the action. Despite leaving this out, the film still manages to be a pretty personal story for Bruce, where he struggles to balance doing what he needs to do and being with the person he wants to be with. That said, the other characters here aren't great. Betty abandons her boyfriend as soon as Bruce comes back into her life, and we literally never see him again after the army searches his house. General Ross is the cliché military man who wants to make everything a weapon, and Blonsky is a weird, power-hungry freak who's obsessed with fighting and being strong. The blueprint is there to do something creative and interesting with this story, but Hollywood can't quite seem to manage it. Like in Iron Man, this film starts off rather intriguing and explores social commentary and politics through the lens of a blockbuster superhero flick, but stumbles in the third act. The effort to explore Banner's psyche is seemingly abandoned for another CGI punch-up between the hero and the villain, who's just the bad version of themselves. But at least in Iron Man, the two knew each other. There were stakes, and both of them understood the ambitions of the other, resulting in their big fight. Here it's just, bad guy has powers, so is really bad now, and the good guy has to stop him to save the city. So no, it's not as bad as people make out, but it's certainly flawed. Yet, despite any issues I have with it, I'd still 100% rather rewatch this than submit myself to half of those Disney Plus straight-to-streaming shows. Society of the Snow is another film adaptation of the Andes flight disaster of 1972, which involved an aircraft of 45 passengers crash landing in the snowy mountains and having to survive for 72 days before being rescued. This is one of those stories that's really hard to believe actually happened because of how horrific the details are. The film is shot, edited, and acted incredibly well, and captures a feeling that's simultaneously claustrophobic and overwhelmingly isolated. It really is one of those films that gets you thinking, what would I do in this scenario? Several people die in the crash, some people die of the cold, some people die of starvation, and in order to make sure they don't follow suit, the remaining survivors had to resort to eating the corpses of their friends to make it through the months. As messed up as it sounds, there is an element of heroism to some of these people, as a couple of them volunteered to cut the bodies up so no one would know who it was they were eating. It was just meat. Society of the Snow is an incredibly made film that captures all of the grisly details related to the incident, while still being respectful to the people involved. Check it out, totally worth it. One of my favourite movies of all time, Blade Runner is a story about humanity and what it means to be human. The human versus replicant dilemma is an interesting one from the perspective of the film's plot, but sparks a far more thought-provoking discussion in the aftermath of the experience. The replicants are seen as lesser people due to their artificial nature, yet their experiences often fall in line with what we'd expect from human beings far more frequently than the actual human characters. The world is filled to the brim with political subtext and works as a commentary on the increasingly questionable priorities of society. I feel that its message is somehow more relevant today than it was back in 1982, and has definitely stood the test of time. I recently put out a video on why I love this film, so check that one out for more of my thoughts. Card in the top right. To say that I'm not exactly a fan of the Hobbit trilogy would be an understatement. I hate their existence, I hate sitting through them, and I hate everything they stand for. Studio interference and a hellish development resulted in a group of films that suffered from various problems, the most pressing being bloat. There was simply too much going on in order to meet the quota of 3 very long films. Enter the M4 book edit, a fan-made attempt to trim the original work down into something more palatable and faithful to the source material. Now a single 4-hour feature with a brief intermission, The Hobbit is a much more enjoyable watch. All of the original film's strong elements remain, such as the casting of Martin Freeman as Bilbo, and Howard Shore's beautiful score, but now we have a far more focused story and a much snappier pace. Any unnecessary scenes that serve only to pad the runtime, like Gandalf's side quest to Dol Guldur, Radagast's entire existence, the White Council, Legolas's inclusion, Tauriel's love triangle, Azog's whole character, and the sillier example of physics, have been cut. Now The Hobbit feels far more like a competent adaptation of the original novel, instead of being a ham-fisted prequel to The Lord of the Rings. It's now just a story about Bilbo and the dwarves. The editors have even gone to the effort of changing the colour grading, not just to remedy the awful Vaseline lens look of the original, but to make the new order of certain scenes more plausible. It's still not perfect, don't get me wrong, there are a few examples of the CGI being a bit ropey, granted that's not this version's fault, and 1 or 2 edits that may be a bit obvious that they weren't originally there, but for the most part, this is a pretty fantastic attempt to realise Bilbo's story in a satisfying way. The work that went into this is insane and has become my new preferred way to experience the story. I think that Once Upon a Time in Hollywood might be Tarantino's most mature film. Now, I don't say that because it's the bloodiest, the sexiest, or the most harrowing, but because it simply has fun existing as itself. This isn't a movie with anything to prove, it's just a love letter to a certain era of filmmaking and simply tries to capture that specific moment in time. The world is so well realised that I never, even for a moment, doubted that I was in 1960s Los Angeles. As cliché as it sounds, I was transported. The characters we follow are all likeable in their own way, but what I found interesting was their relationship to each other. Rick Dalton is our lead, accompanied by Cliff Booth, his stuntman, and Sharon Tate, Rick's neighbour. Each of these people have different experiences in the industry, which captures not only the magnetic appeal of the whole thing, but also the way that people get chewed up into the machine and thrown back out. Cliff has reached a point in his life where he's struggling to find work. Luckily, Rick keeps him on the payroll, but Hollywood wants nothing to do with him anymore. Conversely, Rick has plenty of opportunities to keep his career afloat, but none that he finds enticing or appealing. He's forced to go out of his comfort zone and try new things, never really knowing if they'll pay off or not. Tate is the perfect counter to Rick. A fresh face with the whole world ahead of her, still relishing in the honeymoon phase of getting her big break, and people only half recognizing her. It does feel a bit aimless at times. I can understand why people think nothing really happens in it, but it's so fun to be a part of that it never really bothered me. Sure, it's not Tarantino's best written, nor his best directed film, but it makes a nearly 3-hour movie feel like 90 minutes, and that's pretty incredible. Poor Things is amazing. There's almost no way that I'll be able to put my thoughts and feelings into coherent enough words to do this justice, but this is the best that I can manage right now. Yorgos Lanthimos' films often stand out for their surreal setting and the fact that the characters experience strange things with an almost deadpan disinterest. It's as if the people who inhabit his world are having to learn and control their emotions for the first time, which is ironic considering the setup for this movie. Emma Stone's portrayal of Bella Baxter is incredible, a woman who essentially has to go through decades of growth and maturity over the span of only a few months, and is radiating not only a naive innocence, but a lust for adventure. I haven't laughed so much at a film in years, but it's not just funny, it's also thrilling, uncomfortable, and strangely heartfelt. This is a story of self-discovery and self-empowerment. Someone is learning about life for the first time, and we get to experience it with her, the peaks and the troughs. This is captured wonderfully through the movie's cinematography, as the story begins in a restrictive black and white, since everything Bella knows is binary. What is good, what is bad, what is tasty, what is revolting. It's only when she leaves home and goes on her adventure that she opens up her world to entirely new experiences, and the film transitions into something bursting at the seams with colour. The early scenes at Godwin's home are reminiscent of David Lynch's work on Eraserhead, with the surreal, almost dreamlike nature of things, only for the film to shift into something kind of Roald Dahl-esque when Bella's journey begins. I love this movie to bits, my favourite of 2023 by far. I highly recommend it, but maybe don't watch it with your parents. The Princess and the Frog is a weird one. On one hand, it's the last vestige of Disney's hand-drawn animation, and therefore is a pretty big footprint in the company's history. On the other, it's just fine. You'd think a movie this significant to their legacy would have something more to say, but unfortunately, it merely exists as another story that we've likely seen before. Don't get me wrong, the film certainly has its own sense of identity with its depiction of New Orleans popping out of the screen full of life and soul. The awe-inspiring animation makes the city feel genuine and whimsical simultaneously, plus the lovely jazz-inspired soundtrack definitely allows it to stand out from its contemporaries. Unfortunately though, despite everything I enjoyed here, I can't help but feel like I'd seen it before. Taking our male lead with questionable morals and turning him into an animal so that he can learn what's really important just isn't interesting anymore. Not only has Disney done this before with The Beauty and the Beast and The Emperor's New Groove, but other animation studios have shown that you can do far more interesting things with the concept. After films like Spirited Away came out, it seems like for once, Disney were behind the curve. I liked the Shadow Man as an antagonist, he had a unique design and was relentlessly entertaining throughout the whole thing, but the other characters were a tad underwhelming for me, and don't seem to have much agency in their own story. Tiana was interesting at first, but as soon as she turned into a frog, her character basically boiled down to turn human, get restaurant. Naveen's journey is okay, although I do feel that his change in motivations and priorities was rather quick, and felt a little artificial. It's largely inoffensive and has plenty to enjoy, but The Princess and the Frog starts to feel a little generic when compared to its brothers and sisters. I went to see this in the cinema again with my friend so he could compare the theatrical cut to the extended version, and we got duped because they just played the extended edition again, despite that not being written on the ticket. We didn't complain though, because this film is perfect, and even though we saw them in the cinema only a few months ago, we've started a chain of events that can't be undone now. I don't want to repeat myself, so for my actual thoughts on the movie, check out my What I Watched in September 2023 video. There are hard-to-watch movies, and then there's Requiem for a Dream. This isn't a film that's even all that graphic in its depiction of drug use, but its focus on the after effects does all the heavy lifting here. The fast-paced editing and iconic soundtrack from Clint Mansell makes the act of shooting up very quick and impulsive, while the come-down lingers repressively for days. The story explores the pain of never-ending cycles, and how we find that euphoria we've been craving, and then spend the rest of our lives trying to recapture it. For characters like Harry and Marion, heroin opens the door to feeling good. So good that the hunt for more overtakes their aspirations, their relationships, and eventually their freedom. Each one of these people end up as a shell of who they were in the beginning, and watching that slow descent is what's so harrowing about this movie. The whole junkie angle would be tragic enough on its own, but it's Sarah's half of the story that elevates this into something far more bleak. The argument can be made that you already understand the risks when trying something like heroin for the first time, but the escalation from prescribed medication to recreational serotonin booster is a very real and potentially dangerous thing. It made me question what even is a drug. Anything can be addictive to different people, from sugary foods to social popularity, all the way to black tar heroin. If it brings you some sense of joy or reprieve, the risk is there, and life could very easily slip out of your control. It takes a very special kind of film to make me paranoid of taking a paracetamol, and Requiem for a Dream certainly did that. To me, Rushmore is noteworthy for being a very toned-down Wes Anderson. It still has that charm of kids acting like adults and adults acting like kids, but he obviously hasn't gone full Dollhouse yet. In a way, I appreciate that the story takes center stage and never gets overshadowed by flashy camera movements, but at the same time, it feels like this could have been made by anyone. The perfect balance that he would finally reach with the Royal Tenenbaums just clearly isn't there yet. Max is pretty compelling as a protagonist since he's very bright, but lacks focus and clear motivation. This is a kid who, if he put his head down, could accomplish anything, but instead tries to accomplish everything, which leaves him in a bad spot more often than not. He obviously sees himself as intelligent and romantic in his pursuit of Mrs. Cross, but comes across far more like a sociopath due to his obliviousness to everyone he harms in the process. Bill Murray's character Herman is truly the heart of this story. As well as being the funniest one here, he's also the emotional anchor for me. He's an obviously flawed but ultimately good man who goes through the biggest transition. Rosemary's patience paid off for her, and Max learned not to be a dick, but Herman seems to have a newfound respect for life and the people he shares it with following the events of the film. And I really like that. Rushmore isn't Wes's most ambitious movie, nor his most heartfelt, but I think it accomplished what it set out to do rather well, and didn't hit as many speed bumps as some of his later projects did. Man, I did not enjoy this. It's a shame really, because the original Iron Man was pretty enjoyable for what it was, a personal story where Tony Stark has to come to appreciate the value of those around him, stop a political revenge plot where the villain used his own tech against him, and teased Iron Man's entry into the Avengers during the climax. Oh, they did that again? Huh. The beginning of this movie isn't even that bad if I'm being honest, since it tries to explore Tony's newfound infamy as the titular character through the news, but around the half-hour mark, it descends into an unfocused plotline with unlikable characters and even becomes dull for the majority of its runtime. I also think that this is the start of the cringeworthy humour that the franchise went on to blatantly abuse. It makes sense when a character like Tony breaks the tension of a high-stakes moment with a quip, because that's who he is. However, as soon as you turn Happy, Rhodey, or Justin fucking Hammer into smartasses, it becomes eye-rolling and sucks all tension out of the movie. The premise of Whiplash as an antagonist is actually really cool. I wish they'd done a little more with him because, as it stands, not only is he largely uncharismatic and doesn't have an interesting backstory, but he feels completely tacked on to the events of the first film to try and give him a more personal connection to Stark. I understand the goal, but in execution, it simply comes off as contrived. RDJ is still pretty great in the role, and Don Cheadle slides in nicely as a replacement for Terrence Howard, but let's be honest, this is ScarJo's movie. Unfortunately, that doesn't make up for the fact that Iron Man 2 simply doesn't accomplish anything. It recycles assets from its predecessor, forgets to develop the characters any further, and shoves in a whole bunch of future MCU foreshadowing. I'd love to learn more about Howard Stark and his relationship with Tony, but sure, give me more Agent Coulson and Captain America references. I love that stuff. At the heart of all his work, David Lynch explores the fear and anxieties of maturity. Eraserhead was a dive into premature fatherhood, Blue Velvet saw a young man's discovery of how horrifying the real world truly is, and Wild at Heart tackles escapism and how it only gets you so far. The film features a lot of imagery containing fire, pertaining to how it acts not only as a monstrous force, but also as a passionate and cleansing one. Our leads chase the fire, thinking that it will somehow save them, only for it to reflect the reality of their actions and act as a method of self-destruction. Despite being a personal character study for these two, and this probably being Lynch's most conventionally plot-driven narrative, there's still something otherworldly about it. It's not full-on Twin Peaks, but the tone does border on parody sometimes. Wild at Heart is filled to the brim with references to The Wizard of Oz. This is something that Lynch has done his whole career, and this film is the one where it's not only the most abundant, but the most thematically appropriate. Sailor and Lula are on that yellow brick road trying to escape the reality of their lives, with the latter envisioning her controlling and overbearing mother as the Wicked Witch. Despite technically being a road movie, the characters clearly identify their escape as a journey to something better. They're almost in denial about what's really going on, like how after a horrific encounter with Bobby Peru, Lula clicks her heels together as if in that moment, all she really wants is to go home, and there's something kind of tragic about that. There's an awful lot to dissect here, and I can't wait to see it again to pull apart all the subtle details, but even on a first viewing, Wild at Heart is a really enjoyable time that even Lynch resistors might get a kick out of. It's really interesting to go back and look at Wes's first feature film and see the years of work he's put into honing his craft. Bottle Rocket makes for a super intriguing companion piece to any of his other films, but unfortunately doesn't stand out an awful lot by its own merits. Anthony, Dignan, and Bob are criminals, thieves, but not entirely bad people. They don't seem to rob for the money or because they're evil, rather because it's something to do. They're all quite aimless in life, which is ironic considering that's how the movie itself feels. It's apparent when watching this that nobody really knows what they're doing yet. The Wilsons are clearly finding their footing as actors, and Anderson is yet to establish his signature style, so the movie plods along without any clear direction. It actually feels a bit like a student film. A pretty good one, but a student film nonetheless. However, what it lacks in overall polish, it makes up for with character. While far from his wittiest writing, there are a few funny moments in here, and Owen's delivery of certain lines really hit the mark. The story kicks off rather well, slumps a bit in the middle, and then picks back up by the end, which makes for rather unenthusiastic viewing, but I eventually came to appreciate its heart. Bottle Rocket doesn't exactly live up to Wes's later work, but it's perfectly fine for what it is. Every now and then, I need a film like this to keep me humble and realise that I'm not always going to agree with the critics. The Zone of Interest is a project that I have a lot of respect for and fully appreciate what it's trying to do, but it doesn't entirely work for me in execution. The cinematography is very clean and sterile, shot exclusively on tripods, and the dissonance between the uneasy audio and pleasantly ordinary visuals create a truly haunting effect. That's what the film does well in my eyes, putting the banality of evil on full display. The very real people throughout history that we deem bad today were not mustache-twirling villains who got their rocks off at people suffering. They simply had a warped perspective on reality and managed to desensitize their horrific actions into something entirely normal. It's deeply unsettling to watch Rudolf Höss not only plan to slaughter thousands of Jewish people, but also make their executions more efficient. It shows a total lack of empathy and an emotional detachment shared by his entire family, like how his wife Hedwig doesn't even hear the tortured screams coming from over the wall, as she's too preoccupied with tending to her flower bed. As much as I love all of this subtext, it's the actual content of the picture that detracts from the experience for me. For all my appreciation of its goals and ambition, I found the film quite boring. Nothing really happens throughout its runtime, and while I appreciate that is the point, it didn't make for a satisfying watch to me. Granted, I am in the minority, as most people, including the friend I watched this with, pulled far more from it and weren't as perturbed by its pacing, but I can't help how I feel. The Two Towers. Again, great movie. One of the best action sequences of all time with the Battle of Helm's Deep, and the characters get a little more fleshed out, which is nice. Like I said earlier, check out the September 2023 video for more thoughts. You know when you have those days where everything seems to go to hell and you wonder, why can't anything go right? Well, that's the feeling that Good Time manages to convey throughout its runtime. The story essentially follows the gradual escalation of a particularly bad day, and the anxiety that comes with a bad situation continuously getting worse and worse. Combined with its driving synth-led score and stylish cinematography, the film is fully engaging from start to finish and doesn't seem to waste a second of screen time. Connie is an interesting character to me, since he always gives off that feeling that he's a ticking time bomb. Not that he's psychotic or anything, but that he's clearly very spontaneous and resourceful in tense scenarios. He has this kinetic energy that will always manage to get him out of trouble through theft, lies, and manipulation. He's probably never had to face the repercussions of his actions. Until tonight. Connie loves his brother Nick, but his relationship with him is toxic, and he only serves to bring him down. Connie risks it all, including the relationship with his girlfriend, to bust his brother out of jail and give him a better life. But in the end, Nick ends up right back where he started anyway. It was always going to end like this. I think The Good Time is undoubtedly effective at what it was going for, but it's not exactly a film that wowed me. Maybe I'll feel different on a rewatch, but there just wasn't anything to get particularly excited about here. There isn't a glaring flaw that comes to mind, but at the same time, it's not a movie that jumps out to me as something special. I didn't exactly go into Wish with massively high hopes, and after watching, I can finally confirm that it's pretty bad. In what should have been a heartfelt ode to what Disney stands for, we instead get a glorified commercial for the company's drawn-out centenary event with very little heart or soul. Seriously, don't even get me started on that unfunny goat that didn't affect the story in a single meaningful way. They obviously just want to sell toys. The animation style has been a topic of debate since its reveal, as we've collectively been begging for the studio to go back to hand-drawn for well over a decade, but instead they tried to have it both ways by giving us a computer-generated film, stylized in a way to give it a more traditional 2D look. And I don't really like it. Instead of pumping out several middling projects a year, they should really take the time to carefully craft one special movie every few years instead. But the company's motto has been quantity over quality for a while now. I do appreciate that we finally have another Disney story with a straight-up villain, no twist reveals, no attempt at redemption. He's just a power-hungry tyrant, similar to characters like Jafar and Ursula before him. I was also able to appreciate the message of trying to pave your own path, instead of waiting for life to hand everything to you. But this was a little undercut by something that happens in the climax. The main plotline, despite tying in a nice theme and subtext, was uninteresting, and the entire screenplay, songs included, felt like it was written by AI. I don't want to come across as hyperbolic, but knowing what I know now might be one of the worst Disney songs I've ever heard. The lyrics are cringeworthy and don't fit the rhythm of the song at all, but hey, Ariana DeBose has got some pipes on her. Perhaps as a 100-year anniversary film should, Wish is chock full of callbacks to other movies. However, nostalgia is not a substitute for a compelling story. And that's what I watched this month. It was a pretty packed one this time, and with the Oscar nominations out, I have at least a couple of guaranteed watches in February. But let me know what you watched this month, what do you think of the movies I saw, pop them down in the comments and I'll be sure to check them out when I can. Be sure to follow me over on Letterboxd to keep up with my film exploits, and thank you very much for watching. Bye bye.